to deviate, start just a little bit, but General Ham, first let me say thank you for having us here on this panel. General Simpson, thank you as well, and thank everybody for being here. What we're going to do is we're going to start by letting General Hoskin, and my apologies that we were late, but we discovered that we were serving at the same time in Iraq, and so we were just back there swapping war stories and talking about all the great things our soldiers were doing. So, cool. So my apologies. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce the panel. I'd like to start with Mr. Kim Denver. In 2013, Mr. Denver joined SAIC Leidos as the Federal Corporate Contracts Director, and last year he was designated as the Chief Corporate Contracts Executive, leading more than 500 professionals in the execution, compliance, and oversight of federal, commercial, and international contracts at about a $10 billion level. It's pretty cool. We first met each other and started working together when Mr. Denver was the DASAP. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Procurement. Took over that job in 2011, where he was responsible for the leadership, mentoring, resourcing of 8,000 military and civilian contracting professionals. Pretty big job. That's about 270 contracting offices around the world. Last year, we had contracting in over 60 countries. So a pretty big effort when you were the DASAP, sir. I know the job pretty well. I'm actually the acting DASAP right now. Mr. Denver also was in the Army Corps of Engineers, and he actually ran contracting for the Army Corps of Engineers from 2008 to 2011. He also spent some time in Florida with PEO Stry as their Director of Contracting, and he started in contracting in 1989 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He's got a master's degree from the University of Central Florida and also a business degree from University of Texas. So a warm welcome for Mr. Kim Denver. And also another great leader I've known for quite a long time, and that's General Jamey Moran. So he is now the Vice President for Army Systems, Defense, Space, and Science for Boeing Corporation. He joined the company in 2010. Prior to that, he was with Northrop Grumman in Elbit. But he had a very distinguished career in the United States Army as a retired general officer. He's worked in space systems engineering as a project manager, and he also was a PM for 3 different programs: air defense, command and control, and the Army's tank systems. One of the things that I believe he's pretty proud of was that he was in charge of production and fielding of the 1st Division of the M1A2 SEP Abrams tank. He was also PEO soldier, where he was responsible for covering down on 376 different programs that touches the soldier's life every day. As the PEO soldier, he created an organization called the Rapid Fielding Initiative, which equipped soldiers with the latest technologies getting ready to go into harm's way. The Rapid Fielding Initiative fielded equipment for over 700,000 soldiers within days of deploying. Another job that Jamey had was he was the Commandant of the Defense Acquisition University, where he was responsible for the training and education of the entire federal government acquisition workforce. He has a couple of master's degrees from both ICAF and the Aeronautics and Aeronautic Department of the Air Force Institution of Technology, and an engineering degree from West Point. So warm welcome to Jamey Moran. Cool. And Miss Louisa Jaffe, worked with her a little bit in the last few years. Pretty interesting, neat lady. She is the co-founder and CEO president of TAPE. She manages TAPE's business affairs, clients, corporate relations, and marketing outreach. She's formerly Lieutenant Colonel Louisa Long Column. She was an Army reservist for 28 years, and she retired in 2002. She was called to active duty after September 11th, 2001, as was pretty much everybody. She served in the Pentagon as a Media Relations and Public Affairs Officer for the Secretary of the Army Public Affairs, and she worked there for more than 12 years. She supported Army senior leadership as a spokesman responding to press on a variety of very sensitive issues. People in the reserves actually have 2 jobs, and so she worked simultaneously as a reservist and with private industry, where she had more than 30 years of experience in business ownership, management, public affairs, and information technology. She has a BA in English from University of Florida. And this is also interesting. a bachelor's degree in citrus management from Florida Southern College. It's pretty cool. She also has a master's degree work with Central Michigan University, and she attended the Army Command and General Staff College. Very interesting. She's been all over the D.C. area doing some amazing work. She was appointed by the Secretary of the Veterans Administration on a 2-year term, serving on the Executive Advisory Committee on Women's Veterans Issues. She was selected by the National Veterans-Owned Business Association as the first annual Woman Veteranpreneur of the Year, and was honored by the White House as a Veteran Entrepreneur Champion of Change. She's involved with several other women's and executive advisory board groups, and is an NCMA executive advisory board member. So give it up for Louisa. And last, our moderator, Lieutenant General Kieran Dyson. She is the military deputy to the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Financial Management and Comptroller. She previously served as military deputy for budget, Director of Operations and Support, Army Budget Office, and as the Director of Business Operations in the Office of Business Transformation. She was commissioned in the regular Army Finance branch from Southwest Missouri State University and holds master's degrees from Austin Peay and Masters of National Resource Strategy from ICAF. She's commanded at all levels that you could command in the United States Army. The brigade command was the 266th Finance Command and the European Theater, where from there she deployed to the Persian Gulf. She's a veteran of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, our second incursion into Iraq and also Afghanistan. Very proud to introduce our moderator, General Dyson.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
And Mike didn't introduce himself, but he has a lot of very deep experience. I think those of you who have been working in the contracting community know him from his experience in the deployed theater, working the very tough challenges of contracting in all kinds of environments, to working with DCMA, to being the commander of the Expeditionary Contracting Command, and now the acting DASA for policy and contracting. So thank you for being here. Okay. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start off by offering the backdrop that we're having this discussion against, and that is the fiscal environment that we're operating under today. So as we're sitting here today, Wednesday of the last week of April, we are operating under a continuing resolution. The second continuing resolution for this year is due to expire this Friday. This is one of the longest continuing resolutions that we've had, or I should say CR periods that we've had. And it is also the 8th consecutive year that we've operated under a CR. And so oftentimes when senior leaders from the Army start talking about what the challenges are and what the threats to building readiness are, one of the things that often gets mentioned is the unpredictable and uncertain fiscal environment. Because when you're operating under a CR like we are today, and we're not really sure exactly where the appropriation is going to fall or what will happen when we get to the end of the week, because it's in the hands of Congress and they're working through some difficult issues to decide what's the future direction, it becomes very challenging to plan, and it becomes very challenging to plan even beyond the year that we're in. And as you know, we don't have many months left in the year that we're in. If we go back to when a lot of this started for us, there's another challenge that came into play in the Budget Control Act in 2011. And that Budget Control Act, as I think most of us are tracking, is what set a plan in place for the government to start saving money over a 10-year period of time. The target was about $1 trillion, with about $500 billion, $500 billion coming off the top in planning that happened in the year 2012, right after that act was passed. And then the rest of it came into place and by putting budget caps in the in the law and in the horizon within which the Department of Defense was expected to request our budget. And if we didn't request our budget within those cap levels, then we would trigger sequestration. The action of submitting a budget above that cap would trigger sequestration, forcing you to go to that cap level. Now, the reality is, in the last 4 years that we've operated under the Budget Control Act, not counting the first year, where we actually did trigger sequestration, we've had two bipartisan budget acts that actually sort of met us halfway in the Army between what we requested and what our budget cap was. So it gave us congressional authority to operate at a little bit higher level. However, that authority didn't come with a lot of predictability. It was decided after we were in the year of execution for the first of those 2 years every time. So it was incremental adjustments. So what's happened in the most recent update is that we have a new administration, and when President Trump came into office, he issued a memorandum on the 27th of January asking the Department of Defense to look at ways that we could start rebuilding readiness. And inside of that memorandum, there was a tasker to the Department of Defense to assess readiness conditions in the area of training, equipping, maintenance, munitions, modernization, and infrastructure, and to provide a report back to the president on what that would be. And that report became the request for additional appropriations. If you go out there online, and it's out there online, the actual request for the additional appropriations overview document is the report back on that initial readiness assessment. And the RAA, as it's called, the request for additional appropriations, is designed to do really two things: improve warfighting readiness immediately, i.e. in this year of execution, and to start setting conditions for rebuilding the future readiness capability. So that's where the idea for equipping comes in. There's an OCO component that talks about accelerating the defeat of ISIS. And then there's what I would call a budgetary component, which is realign your funds in this request because you won't be able to do a reprogramming action. So it's going to obviate any realignment beyond what might be decided by the Congress. So the increasing of the warfighting readiness capabilities is really looking at the near term, which is spending a lot of operation and maintenance dollars. And as we know, that's 1 year money that we would get this year, have to be obligated by the end of September, in the areas of depot maintenance, training readiness, and weapon system sustainment. And then there's investments, and the investments are across our aircraft capability, our ground capability, some of our ISR capability, and ammo war reserve stocks. So this is where we are today. We've submitted that request for additional appropriations, and it is on the Hill. The Congress has been looking at it, and we've gotten a lot of questions about it. We're at a position right now where we have a couple of different options that could happen at the end of this week. There could be an extended CR, another tranche of the CR. There could be an appropriation that is passed. It could be at a level that the Congress decides. Or the worst case would be nothing is passed, and that's not a scenario we even want to talk about, so I won't. But that's where we are. So with that backdrop and in that environment, which really demonstrates the unpredictability and the uncertainty of the environment that we're operating within, the first question I'd like to ask is, what is industry's perspective on the timing and how these budget requests have been operating with the dialogue with Congress?
So I assume since I'm next to you, I'm the one you're addressing that question to. So, well, first let me thank the generals, General Hoskin and General Dyson, General Ham, and General Simpson for inviting me here to speak today. And I may also thank you all for staying for the last panel. That's good. But industries, first let me just say that when industry is looking at either a supplemental, a continuing resolution, a budget, or a shutdown, those are very different sight pictures that cause a lot of different activity inside of a company. Clearly in industry we exist because we want to support our customer's mission, in this particular case the Army's mission. When you start talking about timing and what that means to us, what we look for is a predictability, much of like what you said earlier in terms of how do we put our resources, how do we prepare, how are we to use our resources to better support you? How are you going to contract for that so that we can support you, and how can we contract for that quickly, especially when you talk about their resources that are going to be used in the current year. So for us, you know, if I'd step back for a second and tell you that, as you mentioned in my bio, I had 24 plus years in the government, all in the procurement contracting side, 4 years on the industry side. Now I see all the problems that I created, so I can't complain back to the Army. But I would tell you, when we look at on this side of the fence, I've learned a lot about when you're looking at a potential shutdown, just exactly what it means for a company. And I want to relay that because we talked earlier about, having conferences like this are very meaningful, and it's good to have this conversation, but it's only good to have this conversation if the conversations go back and the conversations keep happening. And so that's information that I want to share in terms of some observations I've seen. And so if you're looking at a shutdown, you're looking at a company where when we work to control costs for the government, a shutdown could mean to us that on existing contracts, there's no continued revenue. If there's no continued revenue, our rates rise. If our rates rise, we still pass those along over a shorter amount of dollars unless we're able to replace that revenue. And so that's the impact to you, but it's also an impact to the workforce and the workforce that's supporting you. Because in many cases, we might end up in situations where we have to furlough. Not a great message for your employees, not a great message for those that are supporting you. And, in previous years where we've had shutdowns, you've had situations where if it was a government employee, they came back and they provided funding and they still got paid. If you're a contractor supporting, the revenue's gone, right? And so I only say that, not giving it from an individual company perspective, but I think it's a perspective that isn't necessarily realized on the government side. And so that needs to be factored in terms of prior to some shutdown and even afterwards, because there are additional steps that agencies can take to mitigate that, including surging after operations continue. But again, back to the supplemental piece or the timing of the budget, it really is all about predictability and how we are postured to support you. The more timely and more advanced notice we have of information, the more conversations we're having, more communication. There was a theme throughout the day talking about communication. Really, when the industry is punching into the government for information, rarely is it looking for a competitive advantage as much as it is really trying to understand what the government's needs are, how they're going to contract for it, where those priorities are for the government. And then as it relates to being a supplemental, I think we all stand ready to see the readiness improved in the Army and that readiness to be funded. So.
Okay. So when we look inside of the request for additional appropriations, about $2 billion inside there for the Army is for operation and maintenance money that will expire at the end of September. And about $4 billion is in there for procurement. And that is really getting the foothold on building future readiness. And obviously we would expect to see more in that direction in the 18 budget submission and then in the 19 POM that's building right now. So knowing that we've got this really tight timeline, how would industry posture to be able to help us execute those dollars, and what advice would you give to the Army on what we could do to better partner to make sure that we are successful in using the resources we get?
Obviously we did pretty well if someone saw the numbers on the budget stuff. But, you mentioned about being the fifth or sixth panel of the day. And so I'm going to try not to plow old ground that was already discussed on earlier panels, even though it would be apropos here. It was like Richard Burton, when he was going to marry Elizabeth Taylor. He's like the fifth or sixth husband. How am I going to make this interesting, on the honeymoon? So I'll go back to Mr. Bolton, who was the Army Acquisition Executive when I was PEO, and he always used to talk about the big A, and that's not big Army, it's big acquisition, which involves the requirements generation, the finance piece, the PMs, PEOs, testers, folks on the Hill. They're all part of the acquisition process. And so when you look at the issue with money, so I'm going to get to your question. I think that in general, that and I have been on both sides now, that that folks in the government, and this is not a criticism, it's an observation, have a very poor understanding about how money works. and how what profits mean, what revenue means, and how that all works in industry. And I think it almost ought to be a mandatory course even at CGSC, because even if you go to war today, as Mitch was talking about earlier, Stevenson, about all the contractors on the battlefield. I mean, you're going to deal with contractors. I don't care if you're a steely-eyed killer or a logistician or an acquisition guy. So with regard to how do you position for money, in our company's particular characteristics, because the size and the diversity of our portfolio, it's a depends answer. It's a good DAU answer, right, after being the commandant. Because if you're in a production program like Apache and you have a 5-year, multi-year, guess what? The government's going to find the money one way or another because they're signed up for it. So I'm going to get my money sooner or later, right? So it's not like not getting paid. We're going to get paid because we have a 5-year, multi-year. You're committed to that. If you're on obviously a services-based contract, that's much more precarious. And we have a lot of these programs right now, not necessarily with the Army, where you're in the middle of proposal writing or source selection, or the proposals have been submitted. And, we have a lot of them, TX, U-Class, J-Stars, Recompete, et cetera. And these are multi-billion-dollar programs, which means the design teams and the proposal teams involve, many, if not tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. And how do you keep them together with the uncertainty of when are you going to get paid? When is the government going to make a decision? And again, I come back to the thing of the government has a very poor understanding of how the money works and how expensive that is for industry to keep those teams together. And it's not just the will of the company of whether or not they want to do that or not. It's also the individuals there, what kind of work do they want to do? And they don't want to sit around and do nothing, because, we got good people on these things. So they're going to want to go to find a different job in the company or find a different company to go work for because they want to be challenged. And so particularly the young folks today, it's all about that. They don't care about the retirement program or the benefits. They want to work on interesting things. And so that makes it challenging. So again, I come back to the thing about how do we look at that? Obviously, we fully support, we want certainty. And why do we want certainty? Because Wall Street wants certainty to us. Most of you don't know today, while we were sitting here, most of the large defense companies had their quarterly earnings announcements, right? And our company is owned by Wall Street investors, anybody that owns stock, and they want to see predictability in revenue and in profits. And when you stop and start the government, we're not stable, and so they go put their money elsewhere. And why should the government care about that? Is you want a healthy defense industry. You don't want them taking the money from us and putting it into car manufacturing or soybean production or something else. You want them to invest in defense companies. That makes us stronger. So that predictability in profits and revenue helps us on Wall Street, which helps you. It's a circle that comes around and goes around and helps all of us. So we like predictability because Wall Street likes predictability from us. For our workforce, which you've already mentioned, and all our suppliers. We have 25,000 suppliers in Boeing, large, big, small companies. And so most of the money that we get, we don't keep. It goes to our suppliers. 80% of all the money we have goes to our suppliers. And so we keep a lot of other businesses in business by doing that. So it's a huge ripple-down effect on that pyramid. So I hope that helps to answer the question on that. But when we do get extra money, that's all good. Like, for example, the government says, we're going to get 20 more Apaches. We'd love to make them for you. But so we understand the environment, and we're working our piece on Capitol Hill too. We're not doing it in just leaving you to fight all the fights yourselves. We're over there trying to help get that predictability and stability for our programs. Because just like the Army, when I got to the company about 8 years ago, we had about 175,000 people. Now we have like 140,000. We've cut over 30,000 people. And so and I know that GD and Lockheed and all of them are in the same boat. So we go up and down like the government goes up and down. And there is such a competition, and we didn't talk about it here. We're talking about contracting and finance for labor, and particularly today in science and engineering, right? And if we don't have good programs, predictable programs for people to work on, we'll have a difficulty attracting young, smart people to come to our industry. And that hurts you too. And I know the government has the exact same problem in its technical fields. So that's an unintended consequence of all the volatility in the money is that. So I hope that helps answer something.
Yes, it does. And what I'd like to do, Louisa, if I could, is kind of dovetail on that response, which kind of, I feel like, the response is we're both in the similar box. We're both, in a similar challenging situation. We both want the same things. So with regards to the fact that we can't change it ourselves, how would you recommend that the Army work within this environment to better support what industry needs?
Thank you for the question. Before I answer it, I have to say that 43 years ago, right this month, I was in training at Fort McClellan as a lieutenant in the Women Officer Candidate School and Officer Basic Training School. And at that time, there never had been, and nobody imagined really that there could be a 3-star Army woman general. So it's very exciting for me to see how far we've come. So I have to say that. We're proud. And I think that, as General Moran said about numbers, money, he said understanding money. I call it numbers. I always tell small businesses, whenever I speak or if I'm mentoring someone or just in conversation, I say, know your numbers, because just because you make X amount of gross revenue a year, are you profitable? Is it really a good thing? And so these numbers that we're getting, and of course nothing's been passed yet, so we don't know what it's really going to be, but for a small business like myself, they're just numbers. But what is meaningful is, what does the Army need done? And so I think that would be really helpful, General Simpson was talking this morning about communication, and that's such a great message. It's a simple message, and it's not new, but it's so important. And so one of the things in our own company, we have contracts proposal people, and we have people running operations. They are two different ways of thinking about life. By the way, thank you, Redstone Arsenal, for hanging in there if anybody's still there. And thank you, all of you, for hanging around so long today. But when we get a proposal in, the contracts people are going to look at it a certain way. They're going to say, what does the SOW say? And they're not going to know the technical answers to whatever the project proposal is. On the other hand, on the operations side, they're going to think in terms, if it's something we already have, they're going to think, well, this is what we do, or this is what we could do. So they may start thinking innovatively. And you have the contract side in government. The contract side are very logical, process-oriented. You have to do this before you do this. This has to take this much time. We need so it's very structured, or it has the possibility of being very structured. And you have the program side, which is doing the job. They probably have processes, but when it comes down to identifying the requirements for what they need, they don't think like an SOW needs. A contracting officer can. It comes harder to the program side. The same thing in our company. It's hard for the contracts proposal people to communicate sometimes to the program side. Yes, I know you have innovative ideas, and that's how industry thinks. Industry thinks innovatively, just by the nature of what industry is. And but the proposal writer will say, no, that's not in the SOW. That may be a really good idea, but they haven't asked for that. So I think you find that same dynamic in government between the program side and the requirement, the contracting side. So I think it's really important to understand that, and I think the contracting side has an opportunity to really help for things like, not just now, but you want contracting at the speed of war. You have to identify, before I can have an opinion about $4 billion and how the Army can spend it, I have to understand, well, what problem are you trying to solve? What exactly do you need done? The money part is talked about sometimes as if it's separate from the requirements.
So what I'm hearing you say is they're getting back to the communicate.
Yes, ma'am.
We have to be able to start communicating our message. And I know inside the Army we have been trying to do what we could to lean forward in terms of anticipating how we could spend this money. So let me turn to General Hoskins for your perspective from our side.
Yes, ma'am. No, thank you. So it's tough. We're halfway through the fiscal year right now, and we're looking at potentially having a CR, which I hope hits tomorrow, or a budget. And we also may have a supplemental. So back in the Pentagon, on my wall beside my computer is a big old giant spreadsheet, and where we're working with the different HCAs, primarily with Army Contracting Command, and to look at the various investments that the Army wants to invest in, and then looking all the way down to, do we have a contract vehicle in place that has ceiling that can handle potential increases in cash flow? Is it going to be a new work where we have to put a contract in place relatively quickly? And where are we in that process? Are we planning on doing an undefinitized contract action, referred to as a UCA, which really means, hey, vendor, start work, and we'll figure out the details tomorrow, hopefully within 180 days. And so General Simpson, my staff and I, Corps of Engineers, National Guard Bureau, MedCom, we're looking across the board almost on a daily basis to make sure that we don't have anything that's going to drop if the supplemental actually hits. Now, here's my fear. Here's my concern. The fear is that every day that we get closer to the end of the fiscal year, it's going to be harder and harder for us to execute. And it'll be harder for you. It'll be harder for industry. So the government and the military has been accused from time to time of spending a lot of time putting things together, and then they're throwing it over the fence, and hey, it's December 24th, industry, I need the proposal back before January 1st. We actually don't try to do that, but yeah, really. But I will tell you, though, that in this fiscal constraints that we're under today, it's going to be a quick turn. So just as General Simpson and his team at Army Contracting Command is trying to make sure that we have contract vehicles in place or that we can put them in place very quickly, industry, you need to be kind of ready for it too. So we'll all be watching the news to see how this takes place.
Yeah, let me add to that. So I'd say to General Hoskin, it's absolutely right. I think you would be looking at whether certain contracting vehicles exist. I think for industry, we want to know, as soon as you know, what the funds are going to be targeted for, the requirement. Then, even while you're assessing the vehicles, some information to us about what vehicles you might be looking at. Because we have team members that we look to also on those vehicles. Either we're going to be a sub, or they're going to be a prime, or we're going to start assembling teams to support your effort. And so I think that that's critical. But at the same time, I would say you should also look at the exigency of the requirement to then determine maybe those vehicles aren't appropriate, and maybe there are companies out there that, for whatever reasons, you have to proceed with a UCA, right, to go forward. But for us, all the information that you're gathering, it doesn't have to be finalized. The sooner you can get it to us, the sooner you can tell us what you're thinking. We too can come back and tell you what we're thinking, or how we can help you, or how you can be better postured, or we can posture better to support you. So it is that quick communication and early, right? So
Can I add one other thing to that? having been a government guy, any government person worth their salt has contracts with headspace ready to go for the end of the year. I always did. Made sure all my people always did. Most of the people I know did that. So if you're worth your salt, you know you got contracts with headspace. You can buy stuff that somebody goes around, can't spend their money, I'll spend it for you. And so I hope that's the attitude you have, because it can be done.
Could I add something to that too? That the, we've spent several years, preparing for a rainy day in terms of funding, a budget and predictability and all of those things. But I think that from a planning standpoint, why not plan for that sunny day? I'm talking about the requirements side now. Why not be planning? What if we do get an abundant, funding? What will we do with it? What do we really need next? Those plans can be done no matter what Congress does. You can still be planning for abundance, plan for success, and then if it comes, you're not caught by surprise. Yeah, it'll be rushed, but at least you'll be clear about what you want.
So kind of bringing it all back to the fiscal perspective, the challenge that I see in all of this is just the late receipt of funds. And it's not just where we're sitting this year, it's the fact that we've been under a continuing resolution year after year after year, and that has pushed a lot of our contracting actions to that fourth quarter. And then that has pushed some quick responsive action, some quick dialogue back and forth. And, the end result a couple of years later is we don't always spend all of the money that was given to us. And, we in the Army and inside our community are taking a hard look at that right now and how we can be better in terms of getting the effect that we're looking for out of the dollars that we have. So there's challenges from all sides. So I want to thank everybody on the panel. I think we've done a great job outlining the real challenge that we all have. And I just want to see if we have any questions from the audience and that we can address.
Okay, so the first question is from Boeing. And in order to affect and inform industry IR&D investment decisions, how does the Army more effectively communicate to industry what it intends to spend its resources on beyond what is identified in the POM? So there's a number of different ways that we communicate with industry. And most of the folks, I recognize a number of people in the audience, so most of you are familiar with doing work with the government. There are times we can talk to you about our requirements, and there's times that we cannot. Once the solicitation's on the street, it's on the street. But before that, we have industry days. We have engagements. Probably some of the best that I know of is down in PEO STRI, down in Orlando. On a monthly basis, the contracts chief and the program managers, the PEO, have a big open forum with industry to say, okay, this is what we see 6 months, a year, 18 months, 2 years down the road of what we're looking for. Industry, what are your thoughts? If you look at FedBiz Ops, we put out, before solicitation, a notice to industry saying, what are your thoughts if we were to buy ABC or this type of service? So it's your opportunity. It tells you two things. One is we're probably going to take and put a solicitation together. And so that's your opportunity to kind of shape that solicitation and to help educate us that, hey, technology may have changed, or we don't really do services this way anymore. So when you're looking at the request for information, we don't do that just for academic purposes. We typically do that to prepare ourselves to put the best solicitation on the street possible. So that should also be kind of like a warning order to industry of where we're trying to go. Anybody else want to touch on that?
Well, I just wanted to say that, again, in terms of, I guess, there are things, so from a small business standpoint, there are sometimes things we're seeing, for example, it was mentioned earlier today, things like ISO requirements or CMMI level 3 for anything with software development. And that's fine. But these kinds of requirements are very big challenges for small businesses to meet. And so I'm mentioning this in light of the speed of contracting because, for example, I was just recently speaking with the requirements side about a prospective RFP, and they were trying to decide about making it. They thought they wanted to go making it CMMI level 3. And I said to them, okay, so CMMI level 3, for example, requires us to develop processes around software development and get them certified. And I said, would you be using our processes? And he said, no, we wouldn't. We'll use our own processes, but we just want you to get that certification. That kind of thing slows down contracting if it's something you want to set aside for small business. So sometimes these kinds of requirements get put in that slow things down, but are they really needed to get the job done?
Louisa, I'm with you. I agree. There's a number of us that are part of a panel called Section 809 panel that was set up by the Senate, and we're just about halfway through it. It's a 2-year effort, and it's the whole mission of the 809 panel is to look at the laws and look at the FAR and find out what is kind of a barrier to industry, and then propose significant change. And what we were told by the House and the Senate Armed Services Committees was go big or go home. And so some of the things that are being kicked around right now is really the expansion of other transaction authority, OTAs, kind of expanding it to all like commercial products and services up to like $15 million. So we're trying to take some of the burden out of doing contracts with the government and to be a little bit more commercial in nature. I'll give you a couple examples. So when you look at SAT means Simplified Acquisition Threshold. Okay, so there are 341 clauses and conditions that we can put in a SAT contract. When you have 341 clauses and conditions, what the heck does Simplified mean, right? So we have a requirement, a clause that's required right now that says that the industry, you need to brief all your folks and make sure that they don't text and drive. Well, I believe that's a law in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. So why we have clauses in place that replicate regular state and local laws doesn't make a lot of sense to me. That you have a poster up saying that you have a drug-free workplace. Well, actually, again, I believe that that's already a law. But so we're looking across the board to try to kind of streamline and make it easier for industry and try to use a little bit more industry standards. So wish us luck.
So there's one coming in from Redstone, and the question is, given the fact that we've now operated under CR for the last several years, besides passing a budget on time, what would industry like to see the Army do to lessen the impact? After all, we should be very practiced by now.
Well, one of the things they could do, which they have not done this year, and for those that have worked the budget, I know there's a couple of ex-Hill guys and gals in here also, and that's anomalies. So what is an anomaly? And that is when you have a CR that stops new starts or program changes, so that's not just a new start, but a change in production quantities per the year versus the following year. So those things are called anomalies. So this year, unlike previous years, when they had a CR, they also had anomalies. So that, for example, if you were going to have a new start, the DOD would get together with the services and create the list, and they'd send it over the Hill and say, yeah, we have a CR except for these programs, right? And this year, I don't know if it's because of acrimony between the two parties or presidential election or whatever it is, they didn't allow any anomalies. So this particular year is worse than previous years because of that capability. And I don't know, Karen, if they say anything to you about anomalies, but that's one of the things they could help lessen it, but they've decided not to do it.
Well, I would tell you from an Army perspective, there's always a look at what should the anomalies be as we work our way through a CR, and there's a lot of debate and discussion on it, and oftentimes the anomalies don't make it into the final request. And there were a couple that were put into the second CR that allowed us to do some things. And we also had an increase in our OCO from FY16 spending, which was an anomaly in and of itself. So, but very limited, very limited. And, part of it is they don't want the continuing resolution to turn into the budget. right? What we really want is we want the appropriation passed. And but it is a struggle, and I agree with you. We have had very limited anomalies this year. It's been tough.
Okay, another question. Okay, what guidance is or has been put out to Army leadership regarding managing their contractor workforce during a furlough? During the last furlough, every organization leader seemed to have a different interpretation of what they can or cannot do. For example, if my guys can't be at work, neither will my support contractors. So I'll check on that. I'll take that as an action item and work on that to put some guidance out to the field immediately. But typically, the furlough, if we have a contract and we've obligated the money on that contract, then you're not furloughed. The active duty force, the folks in uniform, we are not furloughed. Now, I will tell you, the last furlough was tough, and a couple second order effects of that furlough. One of them was that, DCMA pretty much was shut down, because it's a government organization, probably 99% of it's civil service professionals. And guess what DCMA does for a lot of the larger defense contractors? They're the ACO, so they're working your payment issues, and they're DD-250ing or White-Ear workflow, and they're actually buying product. So that's problematic. I actually think that may have impacted and sped up returning the government back to work because of that, because it didn't only impact the federal employees, I believe it impacted industry across the country.
So let me add to that something we do in industry. Once we start seeing that there is the potential for a furlough with the government or actually funding not being provided for a contract, what's so difficult about this is that it's a contract by contract issue. And it's also an organization by organization issue. So we actually have to mobilize our program management staff, our contracting staff to start engaging at the eaches into their respective teams, into the government, to give us guidance as to how they want us to proceed. Do we show up? Do we not show up? Yes, your contract's funded, continue. Even if it's a fixed price contract, it could be a situation where you're shut down out of the facilities. Right. So I would say, Mike, what I would recommend is, knowing that we're engaging that way, is saying to the program manager and the contracting workforce is to have them start pushing information to us as well, because we're going to come knocking anyway and asking the questions.
Well, I would say that, kind of somewhat mechanically speaking, as we went through the last furlough, one of the big data call elements that we had to capture was the impacts, and our ability to talk about what are the impacts across our entire community out to all the way to small business is huge, and so the communication piece is really important as we communicate that back up, the chain, so that we are reflecting the real hurt to operations and to interruption to what we're trying to achieve when we have a shutdown. So.
Can I say one thing about that too? I know everyone in industry and government, but everyone in industry faces the same problem, whether you're small or large. I guarantee you, my employees are calling our headquarters office all day today. What are we supposed to do? And we have many contracts, and as you were saying, it's a case by case basis. But I think the most difficult thing is for small business is when we don't get information, or even if we do get information that, well, we can't promise you'll get paid, yet do we carry those people, for several days? There's only so far we can do that. Right. We don't have unlimited reserve funds to carry people. So I'm not saying it's your fault because, you can't control it, but it is hugely stressful. It's a terrible morale problem, and you can have people just can't stand it and they'll quit, and you can lose people, good people, because of that process. So the more information we can get early about it, the better.
I agree.
Okay, we have another question. It says, with the Army's impending growth, 6 months left in the calendar year, and General Perna's hard stance on carryover in our depots, what will happen in September with potentially abundant funding for refurb, rebuild, and other depot programs? Well, the issue with carryover, when we have a continuing resolution of this magnitude, it's, you know, it's right in the face of carryover. I mean, we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. So, you know, we look and try to have a good mix of refurbishment and with the depots and also with industry in general. But I don't know if there's a way around it, you know, when we have a CR this long.
No, but I do think this year it will be very important, you know, for us to all track how we are spending the money that's given to us when we get an appropriation. And if we get a lot of money late in the year, where it's going. You know, we've been given some pretty definite priorities to meet, and the Army's request is meeting those priorities inside of the readiness review that was accomplished. And depot maintenance is one of those priorities. And so I do think if we look at, you know, an infusion of cash at the end of the year, we have to have an ability to be able to report on where we stand on it and be able to explain that carryover. We are trying to bring carryover down, that's true. But, you know, when we have these unusual circumstances, you know, it's not always black and white, and we have to be able to think our way through that complexity and be able to explain it to the Congress. Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, sir, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody that's here, and I would like to thank everyone here on the panel. Obviously, I believe that the topic of our fiscal environment is probably the most important thing that we'll all be watching for the rest of this week, for sure, and hopefully we'll be watching it to a resolution. And so I appreciate the learning that's gone on here and our ability to keep communicating about these big challenges that we face.
So would you share with us what your crystal ball says?
Well, sir, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did, but I'm just following the press, like I think we all are. It is starting to look as if we might see a short-term CR, is kind of the latest thing that's gotten some traction, while the Congress continues to work through some of the big issues that they're working through to get to an appropriation.
Good. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the panelists for a great discussion. Thank you.